Welcome aboard the Bitcoin Express. My name is Chase. Let's get to it. When can we expect Bitcoin to explode? And the answer is situational rather than being a specific time period. Most of the time when we try to figure out when Bitcoin will reach new all-time highs, we give a date. We might say May 20th of 2022, January 2nd of 2024, and so on. But the answer is not a specific date, rather it's situational. And that situation is when we reach normalcy. Right now, we're going through a crisis in 2020. People are panicking, but the price of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency will finally explode once we reach normalcy. And that means people are working again. People have money for food. People have money to pay their rent. And the reason is when this whole crisis is over, fiat dollars around the world will start to inflate and hyperinflate. And that's what I'm going to explain to you in this video. And as we know, inflation and hyperinflation means that the current money supply loses its value. And this happens because additional money is added to the system. And this is not a concept that's hard to understand. Whenever you have an existing supply of anything, especially money, and you add more to the system, the current supply loses its value. So right now in 2020, we're going through a crisis. And typically what happens in a crisis is there is a bailout on the banks, meaning money is provided to banks and financial institutions to save them. And this is not a new concept. This happens in every recession and in every crisis. Banks are bailed out. And the sad thing about this is all the money given to these banks and financial institutions, which is in the billions, hundreds of billions, not one penny is seen by the average citizen. But right now, in March of 2020, during the crisis, we are actually seeing for the first time a bailout on the American people. The Trump administration recently announced that they are very likely to be sending out $1,000 a month to every American. And this is to keep Americans afloat. Right now, Americans are not able to work. They're not able to pay for food. They're not able to pay for their rent. So they need some money. Now, you might be thinking whether this is good or bad. Well, we all know in the long run, this is bad. But in the short term, it might be necessary. And the reason is, in the short term, if people don't have any form of income and it's prolonged, there will start to be violence and riots in the street. People will fight for food. People will fight for medicine. And especially people with children, they'll do anything for their children and there will be violence. So in the short term, you can say this is necessary, although in the long term, we know this could be bad. And the reason this is bad in the long term, because as I mentioned, whenever you add more to the existing supply of money, it makes the current supply less valuable. This is not a genius concept. You don't have to have an IQ to understand this. You can teach this to a fifth grader. It doesn't matter if you're talking about money or anything else. It could be food, clothing, water, books, literally anything. Whenever you add more to the system, the current supply is no longer valuable or less valuable than it was before. And I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking and asking, okay, we're going to add money, but this is money we saved up, money we had. We use all these other terms. This is not adding money to the economy. But the problem is, it's a trick. Wall Street financial institutions use very complex terms that people don't really get or understand. But in the end of the day, it doesn't matter what term you're using. It adds money to the system that wasn't there before. You might be thinking, or I've heard of something called a repurchase agreement or a repo, or maybe you heard of something called quantitative easing. These are very complex financial terms of adding money to the economy, and they're complex on purpose. The whole goal is that you don't understand them. And even right now, if I told you go on Google and look up and read about a repo, go up and read about quantitative easing, you're going to read it and you're probably still not going to understand it. It's going to take you a few times. And that is the whole point. That is the whole goal. They would rather people not understand truly what's going on because people will become upset and they will panic. But this is all adding money to the economy. This is all adding to inflation and hyperinflation in the future. And in terms of in speaking about complex financial terms, this isn't a new thing. This happens all the time. In 2008, in the crisis, we also had complex financial instruments and terms that were very hard for people to understand. If you ever saw the movie The Big Short, it really does a good job of explaining this. But back in 2008, They use things such as CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and credit default swaps. The whole point here is whether it's repo, quantitative easing, CDOs, CDS, complex financial institutions that's not understood by the average Joe, but in the end of the day, this is money added to the economy that was not there before, and inflation occurs, right? So even though right now we're in a crisis and we're seeing the largest amount of money ever printed in history, even prior to this, we saw inflation and hyperinflation happen even without a crisis. In front of me, I have a list of 12 countries that experienced the highest rate of inflation or hyperinflation in 2019. And as you can see, without a crisis in 2019, Turkey had an inflation rate of 16%, which is very high. As I scroll down this list, you see Haiti, 18%. And as I continue to scroll, the numbers get higher and higher. Argentina in 2019 had an inflation rate of 54%. That's losing half of your money in 1 year. If you had $1,000 in your bank now, essentially now it's $500. You lost half of it. And the list gets crazier and crazier. As we get to Zimbabwe, their inflation rate in 2019 was 175%. Now this is where it gets very, very crazy. You might not even believe it. In 2019, Venezuela had an inflation rate of 282,000%. So, you could have had thousands, hundreds, millions of dollars, and now it's worth nothing. It's worth pennies. And again, this was in a time where we didn't even have a worldwide pandemic, worldwide crisis, and this happened. So what's going to happen now that all around the world we're printing the most money that we have ever seen in history? When it's all said and done, when we return to normalcy, this is when inflation and hyperinflation will take place. As I mentioned, in the meantime, people are just worried about surviving, worried about their children, worried about paying for food, housing. So they want cash right now at any cost. People don't think about the future. They need it right now. And you know what? I'm in agreement with that. People need medicine. People need food. So people need to be bailed out. But when we return to normalcy, people are working again. People are paying their rent. People are paying their food. They're going to see their money inflate and hyperinflate. There is no way around it. This is the rules of money. This is how it works. The more you print, the more that currency will inflate or hyperinflate. And who knows, maybe a country will be spared. Maybe America will have a very small inflation rate. But we have to remember, we now live in a global world. We're talking about, we have India, we have China, we have all of Africa, South America. Now in a global world, we will see that money, fiat dollars, will inflate and hyperinflate, and people will look to traditional assets. And it is at that time we can expect to see people moving into alternative assets such as Bitcoin. I hope that you found value in today's video. If you like my content, go down below, subscribe to the channel, leave a like. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.